is EWA Radio, the official podcast of the Education Writers Association, and I'm public editor Emily Richmond. In a 5-part project for the Los Angeles Times, education reporter Sonali Kohli analyzed homicide data to find public high schools that are surrounded by the highest number of homicides. The results provide a stunning look at the physical risk and emotional toll thousands of students experience just trying to get to class. She joins us now. Sonali, welcome to EWA Radio.
Thank you for having me.
Why was now the time to tell this story?
Well, I think that a lot of people are talking, obviously, about school shootings. We see mass shootings happening, and they're in the news a lot. But there is this reality for a lot of students that there is violence around them constantly, and that has been the case. And so I think that really, like, any time would have been a good time to tell the story. And the reason that it came about was because of a homicide reporter who, over the course of 3 years, saw that teenagers were affected in areas where he was reporting on homicides a lot. I think it would have been timely anytime, but it's just an important balance to the conversation that we're all having about school safety and school shootings.
Well, we do talk a lot about school safety right now, and those conversations focus on things like preventative measures, like more metal detectors, arming teachers. And then we also talk about neighborhood violence, but we don't often get to spend time with young people in those spaces in between. Tell us how you navigated that.
One of the things that I try to do as a journalist, especially a journalist covering education, is think about the ways that the news and the neighborhoods around schools affect the kids who live in them and are trying to learn. And so this is one of those things, right? It's not just that you're in physical danger because there's a high number of homicides in the place where you live. It's that on your way to and from school, the impact of this high rate of killing might affect your ability to concentrate when you're in class, might affect your ability to get to school. So we really wanted to spend time in these in-between spaces between home and school to figure out what are all of the ways that kids can be affected by violence that happens around them, even if they aren't a direct victim of it.
What were some of the challenges your newsroom team faced in either getting this data or crunching it?
So the data we have access to because the LA Times for more than 10 years has been updating what's called the homicide report. So we have 1 to 3 reporters at any given time who are devoted to covering every homicide in Los Angeles County. And we have data that comes in from the coroner. And the only reason that we were able to do this project is because the LA Times already has that data. And then the California Department of Education has data on where schools are and all the demographic data that we needed. I did not do the data analysis. My colleague, Iris Lee, who is a brilliant data journalist, did the analyses. I mean, there's a lot of like typical things that you have to negotiate when trying to figure out like education data, like where, we only counted schools that had been open and at the location that they were currently at for the entire time of our analysis, which was 5 years. LA has a lot of charter schools that move around. So, some of those weren't included. So those kinds of data challenges. But because we have the access to this really big data set at the LA Times, and the paper already has made a commitment to reporting and writing about every homicide in the county, we had that data.
I'm guessing that there were some schools where you already knew that violence in the neighborhood was a big problem. Were there any surprises that revealed themselves once you started mapping this out?
Well, that's why we really wanted to start from the data. I didn't want to make any assumptions because a lot of what one of the things I would do when I started talking to people, or they would just like volunteer to do this themselves, if they wanted to guess. People wanted to guess if they could get the top 5 schools, and they usually didn't actually. Because what schools people associate with violence are not necessarily the ones that in 2018 are the ones that are surrounded by the most homicides. And so, first of all, that speaks to the impact of a school's reputation on even people who know the community as well, right? And then also, it means that there are some schools that might be overlooked. So I was talking to people, but we waited until the analysis was complete to really start digging in and doing the human reporting. And Dimely, which is the school that's surrounded by the most homicides, that's a school that opened, I think, in 2012. It's pretty recent. And I hadn't reported there. I didn't know much about it at all, really. But there were 105 homicides in a 1 mile radius of the school in the last 5 years. And so it became about following the data and then finding the people who go to the school and teach at the school and have kids at the school to really help me understand what it's like there.
Well, let's talk about that because while this is a data-driven story, it's also deeply personal, and that's clearly not a coincidence. You spend time with students, including one who has lost 4 people close to her to gun violence, and you follow some kids on their routes to school. And what you found is really what I would call a whole other level of street smarts. Talk to us a little bit about Carl.
Carl's great. He's a sophomore now at Dimely High School, which is the one we just talked about. And he talked to us quite a bit about getting to school safely. He has a lot of things to think about. First of all, his older brother was killed in a hit and run a few years ago, crossing the street. So when he's walking the 15 minutes or so to school, that's something he's thinking about. And then there are a few houses down a house that has pretty active gang members. So sometimes he hears gunshots coming from that house. And he doesn't want to have run-ins with the people who are there. And so his options to go to school are kind of take the alley that's behind the house or go on the on the street that's in front of the house. And the alley it's a little bit quicker, but for him, it's also a way to maybe avoid people. So he goes down the alley. But, if you talk to law enforcement or safe passage people, they'll tell you, don't go down an alley by yourself, stick to the main roads. And so he's had to make this judgment call. And the way he said it to me was that there's kind of no really good option. So he just has to choose the one that feels safest to him.
Well, what was really kind of, heartbreaking about that is he's in the moment. So all of the sort of theoretical advice that anyone wants to give these students, ultimately they're going to have to make some split-second decisions for themselves.
Yeah, exactly. And there have been times where he's had to, on the way to school, deal with things that, you don't want to deal with when you're trying to get ready to concentrate and learn for a day. There have been times when he was wearing it was like a gray sweatshirt with a blue LA Dodgers logo. And he was stopped by some people asking about his gang affiliation. And so he told them he's not in a gang, and was able to get by. And that's happened to him, he said, multiple times. Just kind of because of the clothes that he's wearing. So he has to learn how to navigate that and how to navigate it in a way that keeps himself safe and doesn't make anyone pursue him or angry. And then he also is afraid of he's afraid of all the dogs that are barking. He's been chased by dogs before. So there's just a lot of things that he has to navigate on his way to school that are really difficult. And he has to make these real-time decisions.
You do spend some time in your reporting looking at the resources and services for some of these students. I mean, the school district is clearly aware of that risk is out there, and so are many community organizations. What's being offered to help students and what's working?
It's hard to measure how the programs are working. There's one that was made actually for military families and now is being implemented in LAUSD to teach resilience it kind of happens through health classes. And that has been shown to improve some markers of resilience in a small pilot study, but it's pretty hard to measure. Everybody talks about the need for more mental health resources. There are, a growing number of psychiatric social workers and other kind of mental health workers on campuses, and but there's still not enough. And the schools have to use their own funds to do that. The district isn't providing it. But there are attempts to help students understand how to deal with loss before it happens and there are programs to build resilience. Classes have community circles that are part of the overarching restorative justice practice. And those circles are a place for them to talk about their feelings in a kind of low pressure way. The goal is kind of for students to start to understand how to talk about their feelings in a productive way and how to first identify their feelings.
What do we know, both from the research and also maybe some anecdotal evidence coming out of Los Angeles Unified, about how these experiences are impacting students, the challenge and even the emotional trauma of growing up in neighborhoods where violence is so prevalent?
LAUSD tries to see how many students have kind of been through trauma, what percentage of students have been through trauma. The data that they have is not representative of the district as a whole, but their surveys of, I think the last one was around 8,000 students, show that most have experienced some sort of trauma or have been exposed to it, but the definitions are pretty broad. In general, research going back to the 1980s shows that exposure to violence on teens, it can affect school attendance, it can affect your ability to concentrate, it can affect, obviously, mental health. And then I think a lot of people who are listening to this might know about ACEs, right? The adverse childhood experiences. Homicide is not exposure to homicide is not included as one of those, but adverse childhood experiences do have a lot of long-term health and mental health impact.
We're talking with Sonali Kohli about her reporting on Los Angeles students navigating high-risk neighborhoods to get to school. Don't miss an episode of EWA Radio. You never have to. You can find us on your favorite podcast app. And don't forget to take a moment to rate us on iTunes. Your support and feedback are helping us grow. Clearly, Sonali, access to students and their candor are a big part of this project. How tough was it to get them to cooperate?
Well, I didn't think of it as cooperation so much. I kind of think of my job as helping to amplify the voices of people who have stories that should be heard. I don't try to think of myself as telling other people's stories. And so I talked to dozens of people. And if people said that they didn't want to talk or be included in the stories, then we didn't. But there are plenty of teenagers and parents who do want people to have a better understanding of what their experience is and who felt that telling their stories could help other kids or help other parents or just help people realize what's really happening in worlds that are really so close to them, but that they ignore. And so I just tried to make sure that we were spending time with those people, which is really hard, especially when we were talking to people who had very recently lost someone. Like the presence of a journalist and photographer, and that can be really, really difficult and challenging, even if you want to be a part of the stories. And so balancing that and trying not to re-traumatize people was something that we spent a lot of time thinking about.
You also bring students into the story in some innovative ways. One of them was something I haven't really seen before, and that was you asked them to annotate your coverage and give you feedback on how you had done your reporting and actually put hyperlinks into the online text showing what they thought of it. I thought that was pretty brilliant. Tell us how that came about.
Yeah, so this project, I worked on it as a fellow with the Center for Health Journalism, and part of that fellowship, there was an engagement piece. That was the idea of someone who used to work at the center named Olivia Henry, who had seen a piece, I think, in the California Sunday magazine, where teenagers or a teenager annotated a piece by her mother, I think. And so she kind of had the idea to use annotation to have students think about stories about homicides near their campuses. I thought that was a great idea. So we had a few roundtables, and the one that we went with was students who attended Fremont High School and Manual Arts High School. And they also annotated a story that was about a homicide that had happened near Fremont High School. And I mean, I think that there's a really long legacy of a lot of the communities that are included in the story being covered in really not good ways. And there's a lot of distrust in the media and in journalists and in newspapers because of really problems with coverage in the past. And a lot of them are really fair. And so we wanted to make sure these young people knew that what they have to say is important. And we wanted to know, okay, well, this is something that happened near your school. What do you think? What do you think of the way that it was covered? Do you think that there were things that we missed? Do you think that there were things that were unnecessary, were harmful? And how does this relate to your experience? And so it was a really good conversation about journalism and about coverage and their own experiences in their communities and what they have to go through going to school. And so it was really great.
What advice do you have for reporters who may be looking at this project and thinking about looking at some of these patterns for homicide rates and school safety in their own communities? Are there things they should be looking for and things they should watch out?
Like my focus is always on the kids and the parents. And so focus on them. And there's going to be a lot of people who don't want to talk, and that's fine. And we also made it a point to explain the process in as much detail as people wanted, the process of interviewing, the process of publishing, what they might expect in terms of kind of timing and stuff like that, because, a project like this takes a long time, making sure they knew that the stories were going to be online forever and probably on the front page of the paper, and making sure that people felt like they had the power, especially the teenagers and parents, the power to end the conversation at any time, to not answer any questions, which is really like kind of antithetical to what we do as journalists, right? Usually you want people to talk to you and you are not offering them outs. But I made sure that with these stories, because they were such hard topics, and because sometimes teenagers do see adults who are journalists, because they're adults as authority figures, made sure they knew that like they have the power to stop the conversation or shift the conversation at any time, which really led to more honest conversations, right? Because when someone feels in control of something, they are able to open up more. And then also, I would say if you're going to spend time talking to kids about trauma, like do some work to understand how not to re-traumatize the kid. I'm not a mental health professional. I don't have mental health training. So I know that it's not my job to help people process their pain and tragedy, but I do consider it my job to not leave people worse off than when I met them. And nobody who I interviewed needs like anyone's pity. But empathy and compassion go a long way. I spent a lot of time talking to mental health experts to understand, like, okay, what are some of the things that I should do to not re-traumatize kids? So one of them was making sure that they know they have control over the conversation and don't have to answer anything they don't want to, not like repeating the same question again and again and again, paying attention to body language if someone seemed uncomfortable or was starting to become anxious, kind of pulling back or asking them how they were doing or changing the topic to something lighter for a little bit. And then I usually ended the conversations by asking students some variation of what do you do to feel better, essentially, because you've opened up all of this pain, right? You've like opened up all this emotion and then you just leave. But maybe more responsible thing to do is to leave it on a little bit of a positive note and to kind of help close it a little bit. So I would talk to them at the end about like what are the resources you have, like who do you talk to when you're not feeling good, or what are the things you do to make you feel good when you're sad, or varieties of that, until they had kind of talked about something that is a positive for them and is a positive coping.
I want to turn to a more personal piece of this story for you. And as you shared publicly in a Twitter thread that went viral, you ended up stepping away from work for a few weeks after this project published. Let's talk a little bit about what unfolded.
Sure. So I had been working on this project for about a year. And then in between that, I live in LA and I cover California breaking news as well. So there was a mass shooting in Thousand Oaks, and immediately after that, fires ignited all over the state that were extremely deadly. And I was covering the victims of the shooting and the fires kind of back to back. And this was a year after I had covered mass shootings and fires, the fall and winter prior. And those took a really big toll on me, on my mental health. And I started to have, some of the things that we talk about the kids experiencing, the anxiety, and the post-traumatic stress symptoms I also was experiencing. But I think that like a lot of the reporting I do on the fires and the mass shootings, I do from the office, or I'm anchoring the coverage. And a lot of my colleagues are out in the field. And obviously there are so many people who are like losing so much that as the journalist, you feel like you just shouldn't really be affected by it. When my therapist told me that I really need to take a break, it was like, well, this is a lot, like to be able to take a break is such a luxury. Like I can just step away and say, this isn't my community and I'm just going to leave for a while. And the people who I'm writing about can't do that. And so that guilt kept me from taking care of myself. And I think what I finally realized, or was forced to realize, is that those things are true. Like I have an immense amount of privilege, but it's not a good enough reason to not do what I need to do to keep myself healthy. And so I finally listened after these stories published and also after the LA teachers strike. And I took 3 weeks away just to relax was the goal. And it was really lovely. I endorse it. I hope everyone does it and listens to people who tell you to take breaks. But I think the realization of I have to also be able to handle it, and that means not tamping everything down and just marching forward. It means taking space when I need to. And I also realized after I did that thread was that there are so many journalists who feel this way and who feel this pressure to just kind of suck it up and do your thing and don't let anything affect you. That's not a sustainable way to be a good journalist and to be an empathetic journalist and to write about communities in a way that feels like a partnership and not like an exploitative thing.
I'm very appreciative of you sharing an experience that is so personal, and I know a lot of people were as well, in that you're shedding some important light on something that a lot of journalists experience but may be reluctant to not only talk about publicly but to address in their own lives. I want to encourage anyone who's listening who wants more information about this or who thinks they might need some additional help or support, take a look at the DART Center for Journalism and Trauma. That's dartcenter.org. They have some terrific resources on mental health and self-care for reporters.
And also, if you work for a company, with HR, I would also look at the resources you have. Sometimes newsrooms don't do a great job of telling people what they have access to, but my newsroom, as well as a lot of others, have employee assistance programs that have a limited amount of free counseling sessions per year that can be really helpful. And I would encourage you to look into it.
Sonali Kohli covers education for the Los Angeles Times. Sonali, thanks again for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And that wraps up another episode of EWA Radio. If there's a story you want to know more about, drop us a line with radio@ewa.org. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For more than 70 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Have a great week, and thank you for listening.